Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of my quest to review every single Zelda game that's been released. Again, this is part 3, so if you missed part 1 or 2, you probably want to go and watch those first. I'm covering every Zelda game that was officially released, whether by Nintendo or another company. Ports of the exact same game are not counted unless there's been significant changes between the two versions. I'm also not counting games where Link is just a playable character in a large roster like Super Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart. Anyways, I think that's enough for the intro here. Why don't we just jump right into it? Now it's time to cover the port of A Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance. In addition to various tweaks that have been made to this version, the game also has some new content in the form of an exclusive dungeon that is now unlocked by beating 4 swords. The plot is the exact same as the original games. An evil wizard is capturing the descendants of the sages of old in order to help Ganon break free and conquer the world of light. Link saves Zelda, and then he goes on a quest to get the Master Sword to use it to defeat Ganon. Zelda is captured, and Link then travels to the Dark World to rescue her and the other maidens before finally facing off and defeating Ganon. Aesthetically, this game looks almost identical to the original, although your field of view is slightly cropped in comparison to fit the Game Boy Advance's resolution. Also, certain effects, like shining your light in a dark room, do end up looking a bit strange on the Game Boy Advance. The sound and music are also very consistent with the Super Nintendo version, although it feels less orchestral and more classic video game style. Overall, it's a pretty faithful port of the original game, although there have been some minor changes. The controls have been adjusted to fit the Game Boy Advance as it has fewer buttons than a Super Nintendo controller, and I definitely find them a bit inferior in comparison. One change that I did like though is that each bottle is now a separate item and not just one stack in your inventory. This makes it a lot easier to navigate and see what you have. There's also a few gameplay tweaks that caught me a bit off guard. Grass that you cut down now also has a very high chance of containing a bomb, meaning that you can no longer just mow down entire patches and instead have to be very meticulous, which kind of takes some of the fun out of it. Another thing that seems to have been tweaked is the hitboxes. If you remember, in the original game, I would struggle to hit enemies that were off-center or coming at me from an angle. This version of the game seems to have significantly improved in that regard, but the downside to that is that I also found it a lot easier to actually get hit. And a side effect of this tinkering was that it actually made the third boss, Moldorm, insanely difficult this go around, harder than any other boss in the game, even Ganon. Because the hitbox was just ever so off, he managed to constantly push me off the edge, or my sword would just ever so slightly miss his weak spot and instead hit his armor, which would again bounce me into the abyss. This fight took me, no joke, more than 20 attempts. While in the original game, I beat it in 3 or 4 tries. I also beat the digging minigame on my first try this time, when originally it took me close to an hour. I'm not sure though if this was another gameplay tweak to make it more fair, or it was just sheer dumb luck. Combat in general in this version I found to be more difficult, mainly in that I seemed to have a harder time dodging enemies and took a lot more damage overall. While I always had fairies to revive me, in this version of the game I died multiple times in almost every dungeon. In the original version I only died a few times in the first couple of dungeons before I was used to the controls. Most of the bosses, with that one exception, were around the same level of difficulty as in the original version, and beating Ganon was just as tough this time around as well. Your slightly reduced field of view also has the unfortunate side effect of making it so that some scenery is no longer visible when it was intended to be, meaning that occasionally what would have been an obvious jump to a lower ledge basically turns into a trust fall. There's also several key items and switches that you'll need to hit in dungeons that used to be on screen, but are now just slightly off screen, making it a lot less clear on how to progress in these situations. Another small change is that if you save and exit the game, when you reload it, you actually get the choice of starting the game from several different locations. It was actually a lot faster most of the time to save and quit after beating a dungeon and then just boot the game back up at another location. Obtaining the Master Sword in this game will also give you its use in the companion game 4 Swords, which is pretty cool. And you can also unlock a new move, a special super spin attack, which you can also use in 4 Swords. But doing so is a bit complicated. The first requirement is that you need to earn 10 medals in 4 Swords, which you get by being the player who collected the most rupees at the end of the stage. And this will unlock a new quest line that is exclusive to this version of A Link to the Past. The quest line is a bit lengthy and more or less just an extended fetch quest. And at the end of it, your reward is unlocking the super spin attack, which unfortunately isn't particularly useful in either game. Another new piece of content is that there's also a special bonus dungeon that you can access at the Pyramid in the Dark World. This is called the Palace of the Four Sword, but unless you've beaten both Four Swords and Ganon in A Link to the Past, this character here won't let you buy to actually complete it. This dungeon has only ever appeared in this version of the game, and not any of the other releases. The dungeon itself is pretty hard, mainly due to the enemy numbers and makeup that they throw at you in each room. There are 4 different paths, each of which will end with a much harder version of a boss you fought previously in the game. Beating each boss will reward you with one of the 4 swords. The bosses were pretty hard, but if you go in prepared, it's not that big of a deal. The final fight was against 4 different Links, and it was actually really fun. It was pretty much the only fight in the game where I actually went all out. Beating the dungeon will unlock a special ending cutscene, but otherwise you don't really get anything else for it. So all in all, this is still a very fun game, and I like that there is a portable version of it available. However, I do find that the concessions they had to make, especially reducing the field of view or playing with a hitbox, made the game a lot less intuitive to actually play, and it caused me to bust out a guide a lot more often than I did in the original. The extra content is nice, but having to beat another game just to be able to access it is kind of annoying. Those extra issues in this version actually knock it down a peg from an S rank to an A rank for me. If you've beaten the Super Nintendo version and are looking for more content in the same world, this is a fun way to get to experience that, but overall I do feel like the original plays better. And while the new content is cool, it's a hassle to unlock and it isn't anything truly groundbreaking. Now we're covering an underrated GameCube gem that dared to ask the question of what happens when you cross the Legend of Zelda series with a pirate-themed adventure. Wind Waker is a very unique game in that it pioneered an entirely new aesthetic for the series, and it's still used in some form today. I did play a little bit of this game back in the day, but because I didn't own a GameCube, my time was pretty limited. And while I have since beaten the remaster, I've never really put much time into the original. In classic Legend of Zelda style, you get a scrolling cutscene that sets up the backstory when you boot up the game, which explains how the entire land was actually plunged into peril after the events of Ocarina of Time, and to save it, Hyrule was flooded, and all that's left is a series of disconnected islands on a great sea. You then start out on one of these little islands, Outset, on Link's birthday. I really like Outset Island as a starting area because it's pretty brief, but it gives you a chance to try out all of your new skills and controls in a very safe environment. After donning the iconic Legend of Zelda tunic, you then see the pirate Tetra fall from the clutches of a giant evil bird into the forest. You go to save her, and shortly afterwards your sister gets captured in her place. This sets the events of the game into motion, and you go on a quest to save her. Wind Waker fits the bill of a traditional Zelda game, with you clearing out many different dungeons in your quest. In the end, it ultimately culminates in a battle against Ganon. The first dungeon that you're thrown into, the Forsaken Fortress, definitely feels a little bit too big for its own good and takes a really long time to clear out. At the end of it, after you get your butt kicked, you wake up on a new island and meet the other main character of the game, a talking boat called the King of Red Lions. The freedom that you experience because of the explorative nature of this game cannot be understated. The excitement of seeing a landmass on the horizon and knowing that you can physically go there and explore is very real. Also, sailing the ocean looks really good thanks to the cel-shaded graphics. This game has aged extremely well visually because it commits very hard to a specific style. The music as well in this title sounds fantastic, and it provides a really good score while you're sailing around. And speaking of, they do their best to make sure that there's no shortage of things to do while you're traveling around in your boat. From submarines to explore, fish who will fill in your chart, boss battles against giant Octoroks, or even constantly digging up treasure from the ocean floor. Unfortunately though, this doesn't really help alleviate one of the biggest issues I had with the original version of Wind Waker. It's the fact that getting from point A to B just takes way too long. While there is constantly stuff to do out on the ocean, it gets pretty repetitive and dissolves into endless busy work. About halfway through the game, you do unlock a form of fast travel, but that still requires playing a song, after which you're probably gonna have to play another to change the wind in the direction you need to go. And if where you're trying to reach isn't super close to one of these specific fast travel points, you're still gonna need to sail for a while. Also, most likely because they felt a need to fill all this endless traveling with stuff to do, there is an overwhelming amount of side quests and side activities to complete, and it takes forever. There's a very notorious drawn out trading sequence, and while fast travel does make this easier, it still takes way too long. There's also filling in your map, the special sunken treasures that you find from using treasure charts, heart pieces, bonuses, various items and weapons, wallet upgrades, and a whole bevy of minigames, some of which are hilariously awful, like the battleship one. While doing most of this stuff will give you a reward at the end, the sheer volume of things to complete is very off-putting. And don't even get me started on the pictographs, several of which are missable. Control-wise though, it does feel better than the N64 Zelda titles. Combat in general feels like it got the largest upgrade, with you now being able to perform counterattacks with well-timed button presses. And you can actually pick up enemy weapons when they drop them and use them. And this actually comes into play when solving puzzles as well. The dungeons are one of the stronger aspects of this game, with a lot of them involving fairly complex mechanics that are expertly taught to you throughout. With a couple of exceptions, each dungeon was just about the right length, always had a lot of variety and things to do, and was generally a fun time to work through. I really enjoyed the 2 temples at the end of the game where you work in tandem with another NPC to complete it. Despite the fact that you have to watch over another character, they managed to avoid most of the usual trappings of escort missions. The wide array of items that you acquire throughout your journey allowed them to cook up some really interesting puzzles for you to solve within these dungeons. You get some classic items like the boomerang or the bow and arrow, but the new additions like the grappling hook and the Deku leaf really managed to steal the scene. You can also hook up a Game Boy Advance to your Gamecube to use an item called the Tingle tuner, where the character Tingle will offer you hints during the dungeons and even help you unearth these rare Tingle statues. Most of the characters, Tingle included, have a ton of personality in this game, and it really shines through. Tetra is a great foil to Link's youthful nature, and her band of pirates was also a high point whenever they had screen time. Ganon also manages to come across in this game as a very regal and formidable enemy. That being said, the game does really start to drag on towards the end. Pretty much everyone knows about the Tingle Triforce quest that was substantially trimmed down in the remaster, and for good reason, because in the original it's extremely tedious. After working your way through several dungeons, you eventually return to the Forsaken Fortress and actually rescue your sister. After Tetra's identity is revealed to you, you go on a quest to restore the power of the Master Sword to eventually defeat Ganon. At the very end, you and Tetra actually team up together to take Ganon out. And this was a pretty difficult fight to figure out, so when he was actually defeated, I definitely felt accomplished. I also really liked the ending cutscene that closed out the story. I have gone on record saying that Wind Waker HD is one of, if not my favorite Zelda game. While Wind Waker on the GameCube wasn't a total failure, it definitely didn't live up to the expectations I had. And because of that, it lands with a solid B rank. Overall, this game just moves at far too slow of a pace for how much content there is to actually work through. While it's still an enjoyable experience if you ignore the majority of the side content, there's definitely a significantly better version of this one coming down the line. Next up, we're covering Four Swords Adventures on the GameCube, which is a direct sequel to Four Swords on the Game Boy Advance. It starts off with Link and Zelda going to investigate the condition of the Four Sword. Zelda is worried that the seal on Vati is weakening, and she brings along 6 other maidens to help her restore it. Upon arriving, a Shadow Link suddenly jumps out and captures the maidens and the princess. Link then takes the Four Sword in hopes of using it to defeat the Dark Link and save the maidens, but he's knocked out and Vati is freed. Soon after, you learn that Vati has both sapped the sword of its power and captured the various maidens, so you set out on a quest to restore the power to the Four Sword and save Zelda and her friends. Aesthetically, Four Swords Adventures actually looks a lot like A Link to the Past, but with character sprites from the Game Boy Advance Four Swords game. It does manage to blend the two styles pretty well. You can play this game solo or with up to 3 other friends, and it's the implementation of this that makes it different from anything else in the Zelda series. If you play this game solo, you can use a regular GameCube controller, but to play with other people, every single person needs their own Game Boy Advance and a special GameCube link cable which allows you to use said Game Boy as a controller. The TV will display the overworld, but while you're running around, you're going to come across a lot of areas that you can enter like caves, and when you enter these, your character and the surroundings are then displayed on the screen of your Game Boy Advance while the TV still shows the overworld. This can be used in pretty interesting ways. For example, there's several parts in this game where you need to hide in a cave until a giant bomb explodes in the overworld and it's safe to come out. Because each player has their own Game Boy Advance with its own screen, it also means that you can split the party with each player doing their own thing and still be able to see what you're doing. I played through the first world of this game with 4 people, and then I did World 2 with just 2 of us, which was pretty similar in gameplay, but each player has extra links follow them around, which can be switched to or thrown. The rest of this game I played solo, which again played pretty similarly, except I now had 3 separate links following me around. You're able to arrange the links into different formations like a box or a line, which is helpful helpful in solving various puzzles, or you can also split the group and control the different links individually. There are 8 different worlds that you need to work your way through in Four Swords Adventures, with each of these being broken up into 3 stages, plus a special minigame stage run by Tingle. The levels all feel pretty standard for a Legend of Zelda title, with familiar locations like Death Mountain or the Gerudo Desert making an appearance. Unfortunately, none of the puzzles or dungeons ever really wowed me. Mostly they felt like reused ideas from previous Zelda games. Along the same lines, pretty much all of the different items that you pick up are from previous Zelda titles, although sometimes they are used in new ways. When playing multiplayer, you'd each have a different item, but in single player mode, every single link gets the same item when you pick it up, and because of this, the puzzles are designed to only ever require one item to solve them. The bosses also never really impressed me, always towing the line between very easy or just plain annoying. The final stage of each world will culminate in a boss fight, after which you free one of the 6 maidens from the beginning of the game, and in the 7th world you free Zelda. Along the way you also come across the Knights of Hyrule, who give you special gems that they were entrusted with keeping. There's very little plot conveyed to you throughout the game, with the only notable instances that I can remember being where the Wise Owl reveals that an evil force has returned to Hyrule Castle, and then later the Deku Scrubs reveal that this force is actually Ganondorf himself. Otherwise, you're mainly just clearing through stages to get to the next world, rinse and repeat. Eventually you discover that Shadow Link was summoned using a magic mirror that is connected to a dark world, which may have been a prototype for some of the ideas later used in Twilight Princess. After you free all of the maidens, including Zelda, get the 4 gemstones from the Hylian Knights, and then reclaim the mirror, you go into the Palace of the Winds and work your way to Vati himself, who ends up being a complete pushover. There isn't even any dialogue with him, he just goes down without much of a fight. Zelda then wonders who possibly could have been summoning the monsters if it wasn't Vati, even though you already know it's Ganon, and you then have to escort her through the remains of the Wind Palace as it collapses. After this, you face off against Ganon himself, who does look pretty cool, but the boss fight wasn't really anything special. After defeating him, pieces return to Hyrule, the Four Sword is put back in its pedestal, and Link is celebrated as a hero. There are up to 2 other game modes besides the main campaign, depending on which version of the game you're playing. The second mode is the Shadow Arena, which is a multiplayer deathmatch where you and everyone else playing can fight against each other until one Link emerges victorious. This was fun to play for a little bit, but there's definitely better games that are similar. Exclusive to the Japanese version is a game mode called Navi Trackers. In this mode, you once again have to use a Game Boy Advance even if you're playing solo, and you start off by playing a couple of different minigames like matching objects that are in different chests, and then there's a main game where you run around collecting medals and points, with the goal being to talk to the character holding the lowest numbered flag. If you're playing alone, you can do this as a time trial or against Tingle. And all while you're doing this, the characters on the TV, mainly Tetra, are talking to you and giving you hints and guidance on where to go and what to do next. So all in all, Four Swords Adventures is far from a bad game, but I also think it's a ways off from being a great one. It never does anything particularly bad or wrong, but it also never excels in any fashion. And while the multiplayer is interesting, it's also a lot of work and requires a ton of gear. So with all of that in mind, Four Swords Adventures on the Gamecube gets a low C rank from me. While it's not offensive or terrible, this game does very little to make it stand out from the rest of the Zelda catalog. The puzzles and items are all things we've seen before, the plot is very thin, and the game is far too long for its own good. I think it's probably the weakest of the multiplayer Zelda titles, and as a single player experience, it just has too little to offer to be worth the majority of people's time playing. Now we're covering Link's smallest adventure yet, The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap on the Game Boy Advance. Minish Cap starts off with a classic old-school scrolling cutscene, after which you take control of Link, who in this iteration is the son of a great blacksmith. Link accompanies Zelda to a festival celebrating the last time that Hylians met a tiny race of people called the Picori, at which Zelda wins Link a shield. After traveling to the castle to deliver a sword for his father, Link then witnesses the sorcerer Vati storm in and shatter the legendary Picori blade, searching for something within the chest that it sealed. Vati then turns Princess Zelda to stone and then departs, and shortly afterwards, Link is given the task of finding the Picori people to repair the Picori blade, defeat Vati, and free Princess Zelda. Not long after this, Link meets a talking hat named Eslo, who teaches him how to use stumps to shrink down to the size of the Picori people, and then Link meets with their elder in the Minish village to hopefully reforge the Picori sword. The elder informs Link that to do so, he'll need need to collect the 4 elements of nature, which are located in 4 different dungeons throughout the land. Right off the bat, visually, this game is stunning. Aesthetically, it's very similar to the other Game Boy Advance Zelda game, 4 Swords, but Minish Cap has even more detail in the backgrounds and animation. This game also has a really great sense of scale, with the environments that Link traverses when he's the size of a Minish really standing out for their high attention to detail. My favorite areas in the game were the Minish village, or even the main hub town, which is bustling with things to do. The main mechanic that sets this game apart from all of the rest is Link's ability to shrink down to the size of an ant. I also find it really funny that when you do this in the overworld, you can still control the character of Link, but he's like 5 pixels big. Areas that you could previously traverse when you were full size, like small puddles, are now death traps for the small Link. However, now that you're tiny, you can go through small holes like these in logs. This causes you to see and think about environments in a completely different way, and overall I found it very well implemented. Link also gets an arsenal of weapons and items at his disposal, and while some are pretty standard for the Legend of Zelda series, you do get quite a few that are very unique to this game, or you get some twists on classic items like the Cane of Posse instead of the Cane of Somalia, which this time around flips objects upside down. All of these different items that you get along the way feel very useful, and the puzzles take advantage of them in really clever ways. There's also 2 main collectibles in this game. The first is called Kinstones. Certain NPCs will have a special dialogue box next to them when you approach them, and if you interact with them with the right button, you get the chance to fuse Kinstones with them, where basically you're trying to match the color and shape of their half. Matching these will give you a variety of rewards, like unlocking a cave with a treasure chest full of rupees or even heart pieces. There's also several Kinstones that are required to progress the main story, but the vast majority are optional. The second collectible is figurines that you get from the figurine maker. You need to deposit seashells into this machine and then pull a lever. The more shells that you drop at once, the higher chance of getting a new figurine you don't already own, so you're constantly weighing the odds. Ultimately though, the RNG mechanics made it a lot more of a headache than it was worth, and at the very end, when you've collected over 130 figurines, your reward is just a heart piece. I do feel that Capcom learned a lot from the making of the 2 Oracle games and also 4 Swords, and then applied that knowledge here in this title to great effect. Many mechanics are borrowed from those previous games, and there are several puzzles that are also reused, but I felt like it was all done so much more effectively this time around. The 4 main dungeons that you clear all feel very unique, so even though there was only a handful, they all stood out and were very memorable. The boss fights as well I did find very inventive, although some were admittedly a bit frustrating. This was also the only time I ever found the combat in the game to be challenging, as most of the fights outside of the boss fights were pretty easy. I do also really like how the dungeons in the game play with your expectations. For example, the second dungeon of the game doesn't actually have the element you're searching for within it. Or the third dungeon will let you reach the element right away, but you then realize that there's another 95% of the dungeon that you're going to have to complete to be able to actually get it. Eventually it's revealed that Ezlo was actually a Minish himself, and he created a magical hat that Vati stole, which granted him his powers. Vati then cursed Ezlo into the form he's currently stuck in, and then left to try and find the second gift the Minish had given to the Hylians, the Light Force, which is a tremendous magical power. I did find it really interesting to see the origin of Vati, because he's one of the few big bads in the Zelda franchise outside of Ganon. When you finally do get all 4 elements, you get the actual 4 sword as well, which is again a nice callback. After getting the sword, you fight your way through the dark version of Hyrule Castle to fight Vati himself, and then you battle through 2 pretty fun forms before rescuing the princess. As you escape, however, Vati then ambushes you in his final form. This final boss battle was honestly a bit annoying, but thankfully it was over pretty quickly. With Vati defeated, the curse on Ezlo was also broken, and then using the hat that Vati had stolen to get his powers, Zelda returns Hyrule back to normal. Ezlo returns to the realm of the Minish, but not before gifting Link with his iconic green hat as a memento of their time together. Minish Cap is actually one of the few titles in the series that does have post-game content. After defeating Vati, you'll start back at the entrance of Hyrule Castle, but you can now do a special quest where you can actually upgrade your shield to a mirror shield. As well, there's several new figurines available for purchase. All things considered, Minish Cap was an extremely well-crafted game, and I had an absolute blast playing through it. Everything from the aesthetic, to the gameplay, to the different items, to the dungeons themselves, the plot, it all worked together to form a very cohesive experience. The few things that I did find dragged on a bit were mainly related to the collectibles, almost all of which are entirely optional and can be skipped. So with all of that in mind, Minish Cap actually manages to get an S rank from me. I went into this game not knowing all that much about it, and came out the other side a huge fan. It ranks up there with Link's Awakening and A Link to the Past as one of the best games in this style in the entire series, period. So now is about the time where we need to acknowledge the Tingle in the room. This character, first introduced in Majora's Mask, has gone on to become one of the most popular faces in the entire series, at least in Japan, that is. Tingle was so popular that he got his own series of spin-off games for the Nintendo DS, most of which are Japan exclusive. However, the first game in this spin-off series actually got a European release as well. We're playing freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land, and that name alone should tell you all you need to know about this title. So this game starts off with a mysterious character known as Uncle Rupee summoning you to a nearby rupee pool and hitting you with a bunch of marketing PR about a place called Rupee Land. He then gives you some rupees to start off and teaches you that you need to keep throwing rupees into the pool to make it rise up and eventually reach Rupee Land. However, rupees also function as your life bar in this game, so if you ever completely run out, it's game over. King Rupee turns you into Tingle and renames you, and then you're off on your adventure. You then meet another colorful character, Tingle's assistant Pinkle, and as you might have already noticed at this point, pretty much every character in the game is bursting with personality and sports a very weird design. Overall, Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land has a very nostalgic early DS look, mixing 2D character sprites and worlds with some 3D elements. The game uses mostly new locales, but you do see some tangentially related to the Legend of Zelda series, like the Lon Lon Meadows or the Deku Forest. Combat is very strange, as you just run into an enemy which creates a cloud of dust around you, and you can then move around and suck in other enemies into the fight. There is no skill to the combat, you just move around until the game decides it's been enough. After throwing a certain amount of rupees into the pond, a tower raises up from it, and you can then proceed to the next area. You do this repeatedly with the tower getting taller and taller. The amount to unlock the next area increases each time, and there were several places in this game where I found myself needing to just take a break from the story and just straight up grind for rupees for a while. Almost every interaction you have with an NPC will cost you some amount of money, and you actually have to haggle throughout all of these. Most of the time, if you give them an offer that is too low, they'll take your money, but you get nothing out of it and you have to do it again. Side quests will usually have a pretty good payout and reward you with things like rupee good collectibles or new recipes. You use these recipes for this game's version of crafting, and crafting plays a pretty big role overall, with you needing to be constantly mixing up different concoctions to be able to progress in the story. They also bring back Tingle's affinity for maps, with every new area having a map that is missing landmarks, and if you circle these on your empty map, you can later get paid for your work by the map sales lady. Bodyguards play a very big role in this game and come in 3 different sizes: small, medium, and large. The smaller the bodyguard, the less it will cost you to hire them, but also the less health they have. And in addition to helping you out in combat, they can also be sent off to do tasks for you, like pick a lock or explore a hole in the wall. These bodyguards will also constantly get stuck on objects and the scenery, requiring you to babysit them at all times. While the gameplay on the surface of Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land seems pretty simple, over time it got increasingly complex, but not in a good way. For example, this dungeon in particular, where you have 0 visibility, there are spikes on the floor that hurt you, and there's also a part where you need to push rocks onto switches, but your followers will actually get in the way and push the rocks out of place by accident. And they also repeat this behavior later on in the icy plane, reducing visibility because of rogue blizzards, because, you know, not being able to see in video games is fun, right? This game also features one of the worst boss fights I've ever seen, period. Now, near the end of the game, you find out that the old man Rupee has actually been deceiving you the entire time. He intends to turn the entire world into what he calls his Rupee Land, where everyone is turned into a Tingle and has to rely on rupees to survive, just like you. You also find out that your assistant Pinkle is actually a fairy that was trapped by him, and then you team up with the fairies to try and take down Uncle Rupee once and for all. This final boss fight had multiple forms, and it's basically a shoot 'em up, which is again not something you've done in this game previously. It's a pretty difficult fight, but the dragon one earlier in the game was honestly worse. Once you beat Uncle Rupee, you basically take his place, and then the credits scroll. Sadly, I do think there was actually a halfway decent idea for a game here, but the mechanic of having to constantly haggle with every single NPC over every single thing, coupled with a ton of time spent farming rupees, just brought the entire experience down. It's definitely one of the more experimental titles out there, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. And having played through the entire thing, it teeters on the edge between a C and a D rank, but I think I'll give it a low C. I can definitely see this game connecting with people, and I'm sure there's an audience out there that really likes it, but for me, the base mechanics just weren't something I really enjoyed. While I do think that the developers managed to nail the weirdness of what a Tingle game should be like, and they also managed to work in a bunch of different things that define the character. The game itself was just too long, too padded, and there wasn't a lot of fun to be found. While Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land is a memorable experience, it's mostly for all the wrong reasons. After Wind Waker underperformed compared to Nintendo's expectations, the Zelda team decided to scrap plans for a direct sequel and instead go back to the drawing board, and what we got as a result was Twilight Princess, which released for both the Gamecube and the Wii. For this review, I am playing the Gamecube version. The only difference between the two is that the Wii version is mirror flipped so that Link is actually right-handed, because you use the Wiimote as a sword, and that lines up better with the majority of people who would be playing it. Twilight Princess starts off in Oron Village, with Link having a chat with his mentor Russell, who tells Link to deliver something to Hyrule Castle for him in a few days. After this cutscene, you then do some menial jobs to get familiar with the controls, like riding Epona around or practicing swordplay. Eventually though, monsters storm in and capture various members of the village, mainly children, and when Link tries to pursue them, he comes across a black gate and some demonic monsters, and is turned into a wolf after being captured by one. He then wakes up in a jail cell and meets Midna, who will be your companion throughout most of the game, and she then takes Link to see Princess Zelda in Hyrule Castle, who reveals that she surrendered the land of Hyrule to Twilight Princess's main antagonist, Zant, in order to prevent him from killing everyone. You then return to your village, still stuck in your wolf form. You become human once again, and you're equipped in the garb of the legendary hero. And after that, you're off on your quest to free the realm from Twilight's influence, get back the stolen villagers, and save Princess Zelda. Twilight Princess doesn't really have that strong of an aesthetic that makes it stand out from other games that released around the same time. After the negative reaction to Wind Waker's graphics, they decided to make a much more standard-looking title. Although that being said, they managed to put a lot of effort where it counts into the different characters and their animations. There is a large cast of memorable people that you're going to come across, from the bar owner Telma, the creepy bug girl Agatha, this child Mallow who rules his business with an iron fist, and plenty more. Midna herself has a ton of personality and is a very fun sidekick. They also added a ton of personality to Link when he's in his wolf form through the different animations, and they even gave him tons of dog-related abilities to do, like digging or following scents. Control-wise, the game feels pretty solid, although Wolf Link in particular can be a bit clunky at times. Once you get back to your human form, there's a whole bevy of different weapons and items that you'll be slowly accumulating to help you deal with fights and puzzles. And you actually learn different sword techniques in this game as well, thanks to the spirit of a warrior long past. These techniques are super useful and I use them all the time. While you do get some staple items like bombs or the bow and arrow, there's a ton that are very unique to Twilight Princess, like the spinner or the ball and chain. Even the items that do frequently appear in Zelda titles get their own spin and are used in different ways. For example, you can combine items like adding a scope to your bow or creating bomb arrows. Epona is also an integral part of this game, with lots of sequences, including the final boss fight involving combat from horseback. The dungeons in this game are extremely well designed in my opinion. There's tons of puzzles where you need to do something completely new to the series, like walk on a magnetic ceiling using the iron boots, or using the spinner to go across quicksand and rails. And all of these mechanics are taught to you expertly throughout the dungeons. Eventually you reach a point in the story where you can freely switch between Wolf Link and your normal human form, and this really opens the game up, offering tons of variety in different ways that you can approach fights and even solve the various puzzles. I found myself looking forward to the different dungeons and new mechanics that I'd get to explore, which even in the best Zelda games isn't something that I can always say. All that being said, the bosses were a bit of a mixed bag. The majority of them I did find fun, and some were super interesting, like the Stall Lord, but there were definitely some bosses that felt overly complex or were just straight up boring, like the dragon boss of the Sky Temple. One thing I didn't particularly enjoy was just how many collectibles there are to wrangle. I found it very annoying that certain events or collectibles like the pose can only be gotten at certain times of the day, but there's no way to skip time forward other than just legitimately waiting around. So after managing to clear out the twilight that has affected Hyrule, save the children of the village, and get the fused shadows for Midna, Zant appears and takes them away, revealing that his magic power comes from a different source. And after she refuses to ally with him, he then throws Midna into the world of light, hurting her immensely. Soon after, Zelda heals Midna, and you then go on a quest to get back the shards of the Twilight Mirror, which is the main connection between the two worlds, which was broken by Zant. This is also where I'm going to point out that this is one of the most cinematic Zelda games I've ever played, with lots of very long cutscenes, which can be a bit much at times. To be fair, this is evened out by lots of really quick but fun events and moments throughout the game, but but it's yet another thing that makes this game feel unique. Twilight Princess is also quite long compared to most of the other Zelda titles, and because your goals and objectives are constantly shifting throughout the story, it can be a little bit hard to tell exactly where you are or how much game is left. After restoring the mirror, it is revealed that Midna is actually the true ruler of the Twilight Realm, having had her throne and power stolen by Zant and cursed into the form of an imp. You go to the Twilight Realm and face off against Zant, who reveals that his powers were granted to him by Ganon, who had been banished to the realm by the sages eons ago. After a pretty cool boss fight, Zant reveals that Midna will remain cursed while Ganon exists. The two of you then journey to Hyrule Castle, and on the top floor you come across the Demon King himself. You first have to battle against a possessed Zelda, and then next up is Dark Beast Ganon. After you take him out, Midna then tries to use her power to defeat Ganon once and for all, but is unsuccessful. There's then a battle on horseback with Zelda using her light arrows to stun Ganon before a classic 1v1 sword fight. This entire final boss fight felt very intense and was quite well executed. When Ganon is finally defeated, Midna is returned to her true form, and then Midna travels back to the Twilight Realm, but as she does, she uses her power as the true ruler of the Twilight Realm to shatter the Twilight Mirror, ensuring that the two worlds can never interfere with each other ever again. The Master Sword is returned to its rightful place, and Link then rides off into the distance to seek new adventures. The ending of Twilight Princess actually felt bittersweet, which fit with the game's overall vibe. Because of how well crafted Twilight Princess is, it almost feels like a modern game, and my biggest frustrations with it came from me expecting it to play like one and then it not quite working. And I also think that the game is a little bit too long for its own good and could have used a clearer direction, but all in all, these are pretty minor issues compared to just how much this game does well. With all of that in mind, Twilight Princess on the GameCube gets an S rank. I went into this game not knowing all that much about it and ended up having a really great time. You do need to make it past the opening sections and wait for the game to really open up, but once it does, it's a super fun experience. I also do appreciate that there's both a GameCube and a Wii version, so if you prefer one control scheme over the other like me, you do have options. Regardless of which version you play though, I highly recommend this one. It's a wholly unique experience and there's tons of fun to be had from start to finish. So here's another game focused on everyone's favorite wannabe fairy, Tingle. We're covering the Japanese exclusive title, Tingles Balloon Fight DS. This is also a game that has never been fully translated, at least at the time of filming this video, which is why a lot of the text you're seeing here is in Japanese. That being said though, it's a very simple game that isn't story-based, and some parts of the menu are in English by default. So this game is based on Balloon Fight, which is actually an old-school arcade-style game from the days of the NES. In that game, you control this little guy flying around, popping the balloons of your enemies. Balloon Fight has had several sequels and spin-offs over the years, and that eventually led us to this one where the main character has been replaced with Tingle of Legend of Zelda fame. This game is more than just a reskin of the original though, as the various levels have been redesigned and tweaked to take advantage of the DS hardware. With that in mind, you'll notice that I'm presenting this footage to you in a lot of places vertically and it almost looks like a mobile game. This is because all of the levels use both the top and bottom screens of the DS to display the full play area. While you're playing, you're switching between them constantly, so to be able to actually see what's going on, you have to see both screens at once. The idea behind this game was probably Tingle's first appearance in Majora's Mask, where he is often seen floating in the sky with a big red balloon above him. The sprite used for Tingle here seems to be the exact same one that's used on the loading screen for the Tingle Tuner, which was a special feature of the Gameboy Advance that you could use if you hook it up to your GameCube while playing Wind Waker. Aesthetically, the game looks okay for a DS title, but the graphics definitely aren't anything that stands out. The same goes for the music and sound effects, which are serviceable, but nothing special. The controls of this game are pretty simple. You tap the B button to get momentum and fly around, and you use the D-pad to change your direction. The tapping mechanic can be a little finicky at first, but eventually you will get the hang of it. Your movement is momentum based, and it's pretty floaty by nature. You start the game off with a certain number of lives, and each time that all of your balloons are popped, you lose one. If you lose all of your lives, your score resets to 0, but you can keep going and try again from the same stage. You can also lose lives due to hazards such as lightning. The goal of the game is very simple, you're just trying to clear each stage that you're in. To do this, you need to pop the balloons of your enemies, after which they'll fall to the ground. This doesn't actually take them out permanently though, and given enough time, the enemies will actually be able to inflate another balloon and drift back up towards you. So you need to hit them a second time to actually get rid of them. While there is a risk of enemies popping your balloons, generally speaking, they just kind of drift around aimlessly and don't really actively seek you out. There's also bubbles floating throughout the stage that that give you extra points, and every once in a while you'll get a bonus stage that's just about collecting rupees. I really don't like that the hazards in the levels only really affect you. Getting hit by lightning will instantly take you out, but the enemies can pass right through it like it's nothing. They can also fly right above the water line and be fine, where if you do that, the fish will instantly pop out and eat you. The enemies constantly bumping into each other or these spinning devices also adds a constant amount of randomness to everything, and that isn't super fun to have to deal with. So in addition to the main game mode, there's also a 2-player mode. It's essentially the same thing as the main game, except now you have other people to take out as well. The third mode is called Balloon Trip, and it has you navigating Tingle through a series of lightning obstacles, collecting floating rupees along the way to try and get the highest score possible. And in this mode, getting a bubble doesn't give you points, it freezes the entire screen for a while. There's also checkpoints that you can land on to save the game. Completing specific challenges in the different modes, such as making it to a certain level or getting a specific number of points, will actually unlock artwork that you can view in-game. So overall, this is a pretty faithful update to Balloon Fight, which is itself a pretty fun game, and nothing in this version really takes away from that. However, there are 3 big issues present in this version. The first is how the game has to be played across both screens. I totally get why they did this with the DS, because it adds some new verticality to all the levels, but keeping track of both screens was definitely a pain, and I found that the majority of the time where I would get my balloons popped would be at the seam of the 2 screens. The second issue I had is that there are 99 levels in the main game, plus 99 obstacle course levels. And while this game is fun to play for 5 or 10 minutes, 99 levels to beat is far beyond what I would ever want to play. And when you add in that second mode, it takes it to an ungodly amount of levels to have to clear through. They get repetitive extremely fast. The only reward that you get for doing all of this is the artwork, and I looked at that for maybe 5 seconds before moving on. The third issue I had comes down to the controls. I am not a fan of floaty controls in games to begin with. And when you add this to the momentum-based movement and the constant tapping, it just feels awkward and imprecise. There's a lot of times where you'll get boxed in by enemies or hazards, and the game just doesn't allow for the fine control or movement to be able to get yourself out of those situations. I found myself fighting the controls of the game more often than not, and when coupled with how many stages I had to beat, it was a recipe for frustration. That being said, the game is not without its merits, and if you like the original Balloon Fight a lot, you'll probably enjoy this one as well. So with all of that in mind, I'll give it a high D rank. The core gameplay that it's built on is fun, especially in small doses, but beating that many levels was too much of an ask for a game like this, and overall the Zelda theming was skin deep at best. Everybody loves a good spin-off game, and the Legend of Zelda series is no stranger to them, but with the exception of Link's Awakening, most of the spin-off games in the series have been handed off to other developers like Capcom and only published by Nintendo. However, Link's Crossbow training for the Wii was a rare case where a side adventure game was actually developed in-house. And while the idea for this game seems to have originally been a potential sequel to Twilight Princess, they instead took inspiration from one particular section of that game, the shootout sequence, and then built Link's crossbow training around that concept. This game was built entirely around the Wii Zapper, which is this plastic gun-looking thing. It feels very similar to a classic light gun game. When applicable, you move around with the joystick here, and you press the trigger to fire your arrows. Graphically, this game looks okay for something on the Wii, and it definitely draws a lot of inspiration from Twilight Princess. Link's character model looks almost identical to the one in that game, as well as there are some familiar locations. The environments actually have a decent amount of variety to them. Sound-wise, this game went beyond my expectations, having a lot of tracks that would fit right into a mainline Zelda. There are 3 game modes available from the title screen, as well as an option menu to help you adjust the sensitivity. The first is the Score Attack, which is the main game mode and has you clearing through 9 unique sets of levels. Multiplayer is very similar, but has you passing the zapper back and forth between up to 4 players, and you can individually select which course you want to do. Whichever player gets the higher score on it wins. Practice mode also lets you select individual courses, which gives you the chance to hone your skills on any that might be giving you trouble. There's 3 main types of levels that you're going to come across while playing. The first is target practice, which is first person and you're on rails with a fixed camera angle. The second type of level lets you actually change your viewpoint and spin around, and you can see Link himself, but in this one you cannot walk or move. The third type of level, you're able to actually fully walk around and defeat enemies, and this is honestly the one where I found it was the most awkward to control, and I was glad there weren't that many levels like this. There are a couple of boss battles near the end of the game which are unexpectedly fun. Each level is pretty small and by design can be cleared in just a couple of minutes, as shown by the timer in the top right. If you manage to actually kill everything in the level before the timer is up, you get a bonus, but it's not required to do this to clear the stage. The levels are grouped into sets of 3, with the goal being to hit a certain combined score between the 3 levels to get a medal, with bronze starting at 20,000, silver at 40,000, etc. After the starting 3 levels, to unlock the next group, you need to at least reach a bronze medal on the ones before it. There's a variety of enemies that appear here that you're going to recognize from the franchise. Some of these enemies will actually glow green, and killing those ones specifically will grant you a machine gun-like power-up, which will let you mow down huge groups of monsters with ease, but unfortunately it doesn't last that long. Holding down the fire button before releasing also shoots off an explosive shot, and this is great for dealing with enemies who are really good at defending. The more enemies or targets that you hit in a row without missing one, the higher your score multiplier. The real key to succeeding here is to chain your combos. The goal is just to never miss a shot that you actually fire to ensure that your score multiplier keeps going up and up. There's also a few secret alternate paths you can access in some of the target practice levels, and you do this by shooting scarecrows. Control-wise, it definitely isn't perfect. The tracking on the Wiimote is generally pretty solid, but it can get a little bit wonky in some cases. I also very much struggle to snipe enemies from far away. There is a zoom function that you can use, and while I had difficulty with it initially, coming to terms with it was definitely the key to success here. While using the Wiimote here was never one-to-one accuracy, it came pretty close, and the game was also fairly generous with its hitboxes, which made sure that the controls did not get in the way of having fun with this game. So I'm someone that does not particularly care for motion controls in games, so you know that I mean business when I say that I had a blast with Link's crossbow training. It ended up being so much more fun than I was expecting. It's a relatively short experience, but with tons of replay value, as you're constantly trying to find new pathways through the levels and get a higher and higher score to get the silver and gold medals. And so it's with a ton of surprise that I actually give it a very high B rank. What this game lacks in narrative, it definitely makes up for in really tight, fast gameplay. It's a unique experience unlike anything else I've ever really seen from the series, and it's a great example of just what Nintendo can do when they double down on the better aspects of some of their games. This one is definitely a bit of a sleeper hit. If you can get your hands on it and a Wii Zapper, I definitely recommend trying it out. Now we're covering a pretty ambitious title for the original DS, The Legend of Zelda: The Phantom Hourglass. The game starts with a scrolling cutscene which involves cardboard cutouts that detail the events of Wind Waker, and it's eventually revealed that one of the pirates in Tetra's crew is retelling the story to Link, who is aboard their ship. Tetra and company are investigating a mysterious ghost ship which seems to be capturing other ships and causing them to disappear. And after finding the ship, Tetra jumps on board looking for its treasure, and the ghost ship starts to set sail without them, so Link grabs onto the side in pursuit, but is knocked loose. Link then wakes up on a mysterious island, visits an old man named Oshu who offers some guidance, and is then joined in his quest by a fairy named Ciela. Soon after this, he meets up with a ship captain named Linebeck, who is trying to find the ghost ship treasure for himself, and from then onwards you sail from area to area trying to eventually get Tetra back. Aesthetically, it has a very unique style to it, although not one I'm particularly impressed by. The 3D graphics definitely push the hardware of the Nintendo DS to the limit, and while they were probably really advanced for the time, they definitely have not aged particularly well. The gameplay involves a lot of pretty standard Legend of Zelda fare, where you go from dungeon to dungeon, solving puzzles, getting keys, and then defeating the dungeon boss, often with the help of a special piece of equipment that you get from the dungeon itself. The biggest detriment, in my opinion, when it comes to this game is actually how it controls. So how it works is you move a fairy around on the screen with the stylus to make Link walk there, swipe it quickly to make him swing his sword, draw a circle around him to use a spin attack, or tap on a monster to make him stab at it. The problem with this is that it feels really imprecise and has a very large margin for error. If they had made Link move around using the D-pad, which is coincidentally used for nothing in this game, then I think everything else would have been fine. But having every single thing be stylus-based made the controls a lot more frustrating than it otherwise would have been, and at no point did I really enjoy the control scheme. Phantom Hourglass also involves using the stylus to mark locations on your map, which worked pretty well, and also has you blowing or screaming into the microphone to get characters' attention, which felt really gimmicky. There's also a part where you need to physically close your DS in order to transfer a symbol from the top screen to the bottom screen. I can't imagine how many people this tripped up back in the day. On a more positive note though, using the stylus to trace out out the path of items like the boomerang actually felt really intuitive and very well implemented. So a big part of this game revolves around sailing the ocean, much like in Wind Waker, but this time around you actually get the ability to customize your ship with various parts, which while mostly cosmetic will also give you buffs like increasing the maximum health of your ship if you match the right parts together. So if you remember my review of Wind Waker, I disliked how slow it was to sail around. That returns in spades, but with less control, as you need to plot a course and then either change the course or fully stop if you want to deviate from it. And you spend the entire time while traveling defending your ship from monsters and obstacles. The puzzles in the dungeons you visit typically aren't that great either, most being incredibly basic, although occasionally they did throw something pretty interesting in. That being said though, even with the occasional high points, the dungeons were mostly forgettable except for the main one, but that's for mostly the wrong reasons. Every time you return to the Temple of the Ocean King, which you have to do after completing each of the main dungeons, you then have to work your way through several floors that you've already visited and redo all of the traps and puzzles to reach the new areas. While the new items you found might open up a few shortcuts, it's still very boring to have to redo the same thing half a dozen times over and over. You eventually find out that your fairy companion Ciela is actually the lost fairy of power, and after finally boarding the ghost ship, you discover something you had probably already figured out at this point. The old man Oshu who keeps popping up is actually the spirit of the Ocean King in a human form. He took this form after his temple was invaded by the big bad of this game named Bellum. Tetra has had her life force drained away from her by Bellum and is currently a statue. To defeat Bellum, you need something called the Phantom Sword, and for that you need 3 precious metals held by different races on the ocean. After getting the 3 rare metals, the sword is reforged, and then Oshu imbues it with the power of the Phantom Hourglass. You then have to work your way through the Temple of the Ocean King once again and finally face off against Bellum himself. This fight has more different forms than I can count, and while I did find it rather lengthy, I did like that it forced you to use various different items and mechanics that were taught to you throughout the game, even if some of them didn't work the best. After defeating Bellum, the Ocean King is restored to his true form, and Link and Tetra are teleported back to their world to rendezvous with Tetra's pirate crew, where you find out that only 10 minutes have actually passed. So there are flashes of inspiration where Phantom Hourglass becomes really fun, where the controls line up well with the puzzles and obstacles they have put before you, and you can totally see what they were going for. But unfortunately, this accounted for maybe 15% of my play experience overall. The rest of the time is spent constantly backtracking and repeating the same dungeon over and over, slowly sailing around endlessly, and doing tons of mini-games that for the most part just aren't very fun. And while I do admire this game's ambition, I think it was held back a lot by the hardware that it was on, and a desire to prioritize using all of the different features of the DS, as opposed to focusing on just what would make for a fun game. So with all of that in mind, Phantom Hourglass is very much stuck in the D rank tier for me, although it would be near the top of it. The controls and the constant revisiting of the same temple over and over are completely what pushed this game so far down. Everything else about Phantom Hourglass was okay, with some aspects being really fun, and I did really enjoy the character of Linebeck, but those 2 overarching design choices along with all of the gimmicks really dragged down the entire experience. This game was definitely a chore for the most part, and because of that, I just can't really recommend it unless you have a lot of nostalgia for early DS titles. Remember how I've mentioned that Tingle is very popular in Japan? Well, he was so popular that he even got his own theme pack for the Japanese Nintendo DS, called the Too Much Tingle Pack. 5 games in 1. Actually, calling them games is being a bit generous, as you're about to see, but even so, I still wanted to cover this oddball Zelda spin-off. I had to get a bit creative to play this one, because this pack was only downloadable from the Japanese DS store. Even though normal DS games are region-free, DSI downloads are not. Also, this game is only in Japanese and never even got a fan translation, so I had to translate it live using Google while playing. As a result, the translation is going to be far from perfect. When you boot it up, from the main menu, using the bottom screen, you can select one of 5 modes. The first one is actually the most robust mode of them all, the fortune teller. You load this up, ring the bell, and then you choose a topic, and then you have to shuffle around a bunch of cards and choose one. The fortune teller then gives you a very vague fortune based on whichever one you chose. So I guess it's somewhat accurate as far as that goes. This is kind of an interesting idea, I guess, and it's definitely the most fleshed out mode in the entire pack. But unless you have a regular need for a virtual fortune teller, you're probably going to move on from this pretty fast. In case you have the urge to be a completionist, from the main screen you can open this book here, which will let you track which cards you've actually pulled. It's kind of a neat idea, but I personally have no drive to fill the entire book. The second mode is basically just a timer, so the next time you need a stopwatch, just find your Japanese DS and go 7 menus deep, and this pack has you covered. The third icon is for a calculator, and other than some unique sound effects, it works like a calculator. There is a second tab here that's actually designed to let you easily split a bill between multiple people, like if you're at a restaurant. I cannot imagine how ridiculous you would look if the check arrives after a meal and in front of the entire table, you pull out your DS to do some math and figure out what each person owes. Moving on. The next mode is the Tingle Dancer. You can dress up Tingle in multiple different outfits, and then you spin this wheel on the bottom screen to make him dance. The song playing depends on his outfit, and you can also speed it up or slow it down depending on how fast you spin. Also, based on this text here, I think you can use photos from the DS as backgrounds. Some of these outfits are borderline nightmare fuel. The final thing on this pack is coin flip, which is pretty much how it sounds. It did trip me up a little bit because you actually have to turn these coins over and not just flip them like a normal coin. The bottom of the coin will say either pass or fail instead of heads or tails. There's also a sub mode to this game where there'll be numbers on the bottom of the coins. It's pretty basic. And that pretty much wraps up the Too Much Tingle pack. I am not surprised that this was never released outside of Japan. Considering how little there is to do and what they did decide to actually include, I obviously have to give this an F rank. Maybe if I was a huge Tingle fan, I would have had a different reaction to this, but all in all, this pack did very little for me. I definitely wouldn't go out of your way to seek this one out. Pretty much everything that it does now, you can just very easily do with your phone. Alrighty everyone, that pretty much wraps up part 3. I'd love to hear down in the comments below whether you agree or disagree with my rankings here. And I will mention that I particularly enjoyed playing a lot of these games because so many were ones that I'd never gotten to try before. I'm really excited for the next video as well because so many of those games also fall into the category of never having had the chance to play. And also, yes, I am aware of the new Legend of Zelda game that has been announced, and it will definitely be included in the final video. Anyways, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed, and hopefully I'll catch you in part 4. Take care, everyone.